All right, welcome back to Sister for Sister Story Time with your favorite sister, ChayaFyah. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and support the mission. Um, Today we are continuing with the modern day firstborn child sacrifice, specifically talking about the Zodiac Killer, and what it has to do with child sacrifice. Okay. So before reading about the Zodiac Killer, I'm going to read what Hindu astrology is and what it has to do with the Zodiac Killer and child sacrifice. This is astrosage.com. Indian Hindu astrology in human life. Planets have the great role in turn affects the life of human beings. Hindu astrology is well-proved science which gives the explanation regarding the impression of these planets on life of particular person. Horoscope based on Hindu astrology depicts the position of planets at the time of child's birth. Hindu astrology not only portrays favorable and unfavorable positions of planet, but also suggests the efficacious measures for minimizing the inauspicious incidences of your life. Them words do not have to be that big. Hindu astrology is also known as Indian astrology as it belongs to India. Some other words, such as Vedic astrology and with that Jyotisha, are synonym terms for Hindu astrology. The establishment of Hindu astrology is based on the principles of Vedas. In starting phase, the arms of Jyotisha were not so extended as if they are in present time. In starting phase of astrology, nothing was mentioned about planets. There is only description about eclipse that is the cause of demon, I guess. In past time, word graha is referred by Svarbhanu. Some people believe that Greek contributed in adding term planet in Sanskrit text. The order of planets was recognized in India after the Vedic era. Beside, there are various other facts that are concerned with the inception of Hindu astrology. Hindu astrology is the vital part of lives since its inception. It is assisting people in adopting the right path in life. The predictions of Indian astrology help people in taking the ultimate decision related to money, health, marriage, career, finance, and many more. Jyotisha not only solves the mystery related to the causes of problems, but also suggests the measure to overcome from them. The role of Hindu astrology starts in the life of a human being when the child takes birth. Indian horoscope is prepared on the basis of the exact time of your child's birth. The alienating time of child from mother's umbilical cord is envisaged as exact time of birth. Besides timing, location is included for preparing the horoscope. Both of these factors decide the rising of particular sign and planets. Kundi of a person on the basis of position of planets in a particular house. In Vedic astrology, planets indicate about the past activities of human beings of certain activities in your future. Kundi becomes the most decisive factor during the selection of spouse. Jyotish of sunshine and moonshine. People try to find out the accurate direction from their horoscope when they desire to start new business, move into new home, and want to take any other crucial decision of life. The astrology is regarded for referring the astrologers that are Brahmin, Jyotish, Joshi, Kanyar, and Ganaka. Indian astrology has now acquired the status of proven science that is why some reputed Indian universities have started to offer degrees in astrology been included in Hindu astrology. The science of these signs is analyzed based on positions of planets. The sky or universe is divided into 12 different parts. Each division is referred as the help of chart depicting planetary positions. Um, we'll leave it there. Now, I have the book here, The Witness of the Stars, and I wanted to read the sign of Taurus. And what this all has to do, or as a matter of fact, I will read Gemini because this has a lot to do with Gemini twins and the coven and the ciphering of one twin energy into the other. So one twin kills the other twin to take their power. Let's see. I want to look up the Dendera Egyptian zodiac. See if we can get. I like these fandom things. Okay, let's see with this one. History of the astronic tradition. Yeah, let's try this one. No, I didn't mean to do that. Okay. Astronism.wikia.org. This is a non-fiction astronic article. The Vendax symbol of astronism. Astronism is a religion that is part of the wider astronic tradition of religions and philosophies. The term astronic is therefore used to refer to the superstructure of thoughts and beliefs from which the astronist perspective has emerged. Astronic history is the historical development of the astronic tradition of religions and philosophies, particularly oriented on the history of religions with an astronomical theme that began during the Stone Age some 40,000 years ago. In exploring the history of the astronic tradition, events, beliefs, and practices are considered according to two primary dimensions. The first of which is according to time, while the second is according location. Depending on which point in the chronology that is being referred to, different entirely separated civilizations will have experienced different interactions with the astronic tradition. Unlike in other forms of historical chronology, some of the ages in the timeline for astronic history overlap with one another as they focus on particular events taking place in the spheres of astronomical religion, as well as in the conflicts between religion and astronomy, namely the astrological age and the age of inquiry. The study of the history of astronomic tradition encompasses two branches named archaeoastronology and astronic historiography. Archaeoastronology studies the prehistoric and ancient forms of astronomical religion, while astronic historiography explores the writing of astronic history. I just want the Tindera. Well, we might need to read this. Let's see. Let's read. The origins and purpose. So the exploration of the astronic tradition had started to occur as part of expansions in archaeology and in the anthropology of religion in the 20th century. However, the first coherent timeline for the astronic tradition was formed by Cometon during the founding of Astronism era. Astronist scholarship makes two main claims regarding the historical influence of the astronic tradition. Firstly, that it is the oldest continuously practiced religious tradition, thus trumping Hinduism, which has long since claimed that same title, which we just got through reading. Secondly, that the astronic tradition, particularly astronomical religions, are at least the third oldest, if not the oldest, form of religious expression in human history, possibly preceded only by bear worship and beliefs in an afterlife. Some astronist scholars, including Cometon himself, have postulated that the only archaeologically verifiable connection between certain practices and religious belief were the depictions of stars and constellations on stone walls dating back to the early Paleolithic period, which suggests around the same time that the Aurignacian Lowenmensch figurine has been dated, to which demonstrates a belief in zoomorphism that possibly represents a deity. General ages of the astronic tradition. Forming a timeline for the history of the astronic tradition combines a multitude of dimensions: history of religion, history of astronomy, history of astrology, of science, philosophy, technology, agriculture, and of calendars. Primordial age, 40,000 through 30,000 BCE, simultaneously occurring periods: Upper Paleolithic period of the Stone Age, circa 50,000 to 10,000 BCE. The dawn of belief. On an amulet found, Ursa Major is depicted with meticulous care to demonstrate the differences between the brightness of certain stars over others by varying the sizes of the cavities carved. Furthermore, the positions that the stars are depicted in demonstrate a great accuracy and antiquity for the amulet. Stone walls were carved depicting arrangements of stars and constellations that match their historical positions, particularly circumpolar constellations. Carvings on rock walls, sacrificial stones, as well as amulets depicting the northern stars were hallmarks of this earliest astronomically themed faith. The beginning of utilitarian faith. Archaeologist Alexander Marshak put forward a theory in 1972 that bone sticks from locations like Africa and Europe form from possibly as long ago as 35,000 is an interpretation that has met with criticism. Primitive age, 30,000 through 12,000 BCE, simultaneously occurring periods are the Copper Age, 5,000 to 2300 BCE, and Bronze Age, 2300 to 500 BCE. The emergence of concepts, 30,000 through 15,000 BCE. 30,000 BCE. Others who developed this astronomical science included ancient mariners who journeyed thousands of miles through the open seas, such as the Polynesians, whose long Pacific voyages have been estimated to have begun at least 30,000 years ago. In many ancient religions, the northern circumpolar stars were associated with darkness, death, and the underworld of the dead. 15,000 BCE, the myth of the cosmic hunt is believed to have developed at least at this time for it to have diffused across the Bering Land Bridge. The cosmic hunt is believed by astronists to be the oldest form of the belief now known as translationism. Furthermore, this myth was later incorporated into Greek mythology in the story of Callisto, usually in the form of catastrophism tourism as part of a tradition now referred to in astronomism as mythoasterism, constellation myths, which has become incorporated in the astronic mythology. The oldest astronomical religion, if not the oldest known religion in human history that we have archaeological evidence for, emerges as the North Star cult. The first religious dissemination in 15,000 through 12,000 BCE in Peking, China, was a shrine devoted to the North Star deity. Such worship of the northern stars may have been associated with timekeeping, as the positions of the stars could identify the annual seasons. Spring began when the tail of Ursa Major pointed east at nightfall, summer when it was directed toward the south, autumn when it lay to the west, and winter when it pointed north. The stars of Ursa Major were appropriately called the seven directors. In China, the North Polar Star was invoked as great imperial ruler of heaven, and within a sacred enclosure of the temple at Peking was a shrine dedicated to the North Star god, having tablets to the sun, the five bright planets, Ursa Major, and the 28 constellations or lunar mansions of the Chinese zodiac on its walls. It is clear from the examples provided that the worship of the northern stars may have had a utilitarian basis. The wheel of the north served as a clock face long before the age of mechanical timekeepers, with its hands pointing out both the hours of the night and the seasons of the year. It is believed that the swastika symbol first originated in China from the four significant positions of the Ursa Major due to its usefulness in predicting the seasons. In addition to this, a three-armed form of the swastika known as the triskelion is found with the swastika in such widely separated places as Germany, where it is carved on a spearhead, Sweden, where it appears on a bronze brooch, and Arkansas, where it is painted on pottery. It represents three positions of Ursa Major. Meanwhile, a two-armed form of the swastika is frequently found in the Maya and Mexican codices and was probably the hieroglyph for Ursa Major. The deification of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars all followed as a logical consequence of people's gratitude to those celestial bodies on whom their survival was dependent. Agricultural age 12,000 through 500 BCE, the influence of the stars. Likewise, as agriculture developed, the need to keep accurate time led to more careful tracking of the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, resulting with their deification when they became inextricably linked with the means of survival. The Warrenfield calendar in the Dee River Valley of Scotland's Aberdeenshire, first excavated in 2004 but only in 2013, revealed as a find of huge significance. It is to date the world's oldest known calendar, created around 8000 BC and predating all other calendars by some 5,000 years. The calendar takes the form of an early Mesolithic monument containing a series of 12 pits, which appear to help the observer track lunar months by mimicking the phases of the moon. It also aligns sunrise at the winter solstice, thus coordinating the solar year with the lunar cycles. The monument had been maintained and periodically reshaped, perhaps up to hundreds of times, in response to shifting solar/lunar cycles over the course of 6,000 years until the calendar fell out of use around 4,000 years ago. Astronomical lore began to develop. Beliefs began to emerge that the sun, the moon, and the stars held direct authority over the quality and abundance of crops. This emerged as a belief that the survival of the village was dependent on the affairs of the celestial bodies. The usefulness of the moon was also significant for early peoples due to its conspicuous change in size and shape from one night to the next, which provided a way of counting off the days of the month, thus forming the basis for the first primitive calendar. In order to count the days of the moon's age, it was necessary to invent numerals beyond the 20 fingers and toes, which formed the abacus on which our earliest ancestors solved their simple arithmetical problems. Goseck Circle is located in Germany and belongs to the linear pottery culture. First discovered in 1991, its significance was only clear after results from archaeological digs became available in 2004. The site is one of hundreds of similar circular enclosures built in a region encompassing Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic during a 200-year period starting shortly after 5000 BC. The first civilizations, 5000 through 2800 BCE. Our knowledge of Sumerian astronomy is indirect via the earliest Babylonian star catalogs dating from about 1200 BC. The fact that many star names appear in Sumerian suggests a continuity reaching into the early Bronze Age. Astral theology, which gave planetary gods an important role in Mesopotamian mythology and religion, began with the Sumerians. The belief that the king was the son of the sun god, if not the sun god himself in earthly form, was well established by this time. In Egypt in particular, their doctrine was of particular dominance in their solar region. When the dynasty associated with the Heliopolis held sovereignty over all Egypt. Furthermore, it has also been found that the belief in the divine kingship and its solar origin was shared by the ancestors of the Aryans from India to Ireland. In the king's veins ran the liquid of Ra, a magnetic fluid as luminous as the sun itself and the source of all life, strength, and continuance. The pharaoh was believed to exercise power over the water supply, the fertility of the soil, and the growth of vegetation. The occurrence of famines were thought to be due to a failure in his powers, and he was either swiftly sacrificed or deposed, whether were after his son would take his place on the throne. Astronomy in the Indian subcontinent dates back to the period of Indus Valley civilization during the third millennium BCE, when it was used to create calendars. As the Indus Valley civilization did not leave behind written documents, the oldest extant Indian astronomical text is the Vedanga Jyotisha, dating from the Vedic period. Vedanga Jyotisha describes rules for tracking the motions of the sun and the moon for the purposes of ritual. During the 6th century, astronomy was influenced by the Greek and Byzantine astronomical traditions. In Ireland, where much power rested with the Druids, the kings were removed regularly every few years. Stonehenge is believed to have been constructed. Ancient peoples wanted to know the exact date of the summer solstice or the standstill of the sun at its most northerly point. And so, in many parts of the world, they built temples whose fallen stones still point to the place of sunrise or sunset on June 22nd. Examples of which include Stonehenge and the Temple of Amun Ra in Karnak, Egypt. In the ancient Egyptian calendar, the date of the annual flooding of the Nile was predicted by observing the heliacal rising of a star. The Godly Kings, 2800 to 500 BCE. The moon god of Mesopotamia came to be worshipped as the bestower of counting, numerals, the alphabet, the art of writing, literature, and finally, all wisdom. Some of the glyphs are found in the flat surfaces of rocks, which seem to have served as altars, the cavities being of the type known as sacrificial cups used to collect the blood of the offering. The association of these rock engravings with primitive religion, prehistoric astronomical religion, is thus established by one, their presence on the sacrificial rock faces, and two, by their connection with amulets reputed to have magical powers. This begs the question of why there was an apparent vital interest by these prehistoric societies in connecting circumpolar constellations with religious practices and rituals. Further, rock engravings found in Bohuslän in Sweden depict the Big Dipper. In Mesopotamia and the civilized land of the Nile, the sun god was revered as the lawgiver. From regulating the procession of days, seasons, and years, he came to rule supreme over the whole ritual of existence. The Coquino site, discovered in 2001, sits atop an extinct volcano cone at an elevation of 1,013 meters or 3,323 feet, occupying about 0.5 hectares, overlooking the surrounding countryside in North Macedonia. A Bronze Age astronomical observatory was constructed there around 1900 BC and continuously served the nearby community that lived there until about 700 BC. The central space was used to observe the rising of the sun and full moon. Three markings locate sunrise at the summer and winter solstices and at the two equinoxes. Four more give the minimum and maximum declinations of the full moon in summer and in winter. Two measure the lengths of lunar months. Together, they reconcile solar and lunar cycles in marking the 235 lunations that occur during 19 solar years, regulating a lunar calendar. On a platform separate from the central space at lower elevations, four stone seats or thrones were made in North Star alignment, together with a trench marker cut in the eastern wall. This marker allows the rising sun's light to fall on only the second throne at midsummer, about July 31st. It was used for ritual ceremony linking the ruler to the local sun god, and also marked the end of the growing season and time for harvest. Babylonian astronomy from early times associates stars with deities, but the heavens as the residence of an anthropomorphic pantheon, and later of monotheistic God and his retinue of angels, is a later development, gradually replacing the notion of the pantheon residing or convening on the summit of high mountains. Say's 1913 argues a parallelism of the stellar theology of Babylon and Egypt, both countries absorbing popular star worship into the official pantheon of their respective state religions by identification of gods with stars or planets. King Hammurabi in Chaldea presented one of the most ancient codifications of law, which was given to him by Shamash, the sun god. The laws, codified into 282 paragraphs, remarkably show concern for the poor and the oppressed, as well as being engraved upon a block of stone 8 feet high, together with a bas relief depicting the sun god in the act of handing the tablet of the laws to the king. Gradually sophisticating star charts emerged, one of which depicting Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, Auriga, Cephas, and Gemini is considered to be the oldest star chart in the world. Another chart of similar time period was found at Dendera, Egypt, which dates back to 1700 BCE. This depicted humans in boats moving across the sky. The Nebra sky disk is a Bronze Age bronze disk that was buried in Germany, not far from the Goseck Circle around 1600 BC. It measures about 30 centimeters diameter with a mass of 2.2 kilograms and displays a blue-green patina from oxidization inlaid with gold symbols. Found by archaeological thieves in 1999 and recovered in Switzerland in 2002. It was soon recognized as a spectacular discovery among the most important of the 20th century. Investigations revealed that the object had been in use around 400 years before burial, 2000 BC, but that its use had been forgotten by the time of burial. The inlaid gold depicted the full moon, a crescent moon about 4 or 5 days old, and the Pleiades star cluster in a specific arrangement, forming the earliest known depiction of celestial phenomena. 12 lunar months pass in 354 days, requiring a calendar to insert a leap month every 2 or 3 years in order to keep synchronized with the solar year's seasons, making it lunisolar. The earliest known descriptions of this coordination were recorded by the Babylonians in 6th or 7th centuries BC, over 1,000 years later. Those descriptions verified ancient knowledge of the Nebra sky disk celestial depiction as the precise arrangement needed to judge when to insert the intercalary month into a lunar solar calendar, making it an astronomical clock for regulating such a calendar 1,000 or more years before any other known method. That sounds like a bit much. So 1500 BCE, various forms of astrology, astrology can be found in the Zen, which was widely practiced in Persia and surrounding regions before the Islamic conquest of Persia and Central Asia occurred. One passage in the Zen Avesta is particularly explicit of the role of astrology. Okay. We sacrifice unto the new moon, the holy and master of holiness. We sacrifice unto the full moon, the holy and master of holiness. 1400 to 800 BCE, golden hats of Germany, France, and Switzerland dating from 1400 to 800 BC are associated with the Bronze Age Urnfield culture. The golden hats are decorated with a spiral motif of the sun and the moon. They were probably a kind of calendar used to calibrate between the lunar and solar calendars. Modern scholarship has demonstrated that the ornamentation of the gold leaf cones of the Schifferstadt type, to which the Berlin gold hat example belongs, represent systematic sequences in terms of number and types of ornaments per band. A detailed study of the Berlin example, which is the only fully preserved one, showed that these symbols probably represent a lunisolar calendar. The object would have permitted the determination of dates or periods in both lunar and solar calendars. Astrology does not appear to have been common in the Levant prior to the Iron Age and becomes popular under Assyrian influence. The Sabians were notorious for their astrology, for which reason the practice is also known as Sabaism or Sabianism. Similarly, the Chaldeans came to be seen as the prototypical astrologers and star worshippers by the Greeks. 1200 to 165 BCE. The Hebrew Bible contains repeated reference to astrology. Thus, Deuteronomy 4:19 and 17:3 contains a stern warning against worshiping the sun, moon, stars, or any of the heavenly hosts. Relapse into worshiping the host of heaven, example, the stars, is said to have been the cause of the fall of the kingdom of Judah in 2 Kings 17:16. King Josiah in 621 BC is recorded as having abolished all kinds of idolatry in Judah, but astrology was continued in private. Zephaniah 1 and 5, Jeremiah 8 and 2, and 19:13. Ezekiel 8 and 16 describes sun worship practiced in the court of the Temple of Jerusalem, and Jeremiah 44 and 17 claims that even after the destruction of the temple, women in particular insisted on continuing their worship of the Queen of Heaven. Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, as well as the old Basilica of St. Peter at Rome, were both oriented towards the east in order that the first rays of sunrise might cast through and illuminate the altar. In the Persian cult of Mithraism, which was carried to Gaul and Britain by the Roman army, the king was said to be the sun itself in a human body. It was from these early star cults that ultimately formed the seasons of the agricultural year. The word hieroglyph, sacred carving, suggests that the first calligraphy was associated with religion in around 600 BCE. Okay, now, let's see. Okay, the divergence of astronomy, we're focusing on the Egyptian. In 525 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, so there is likely to have been some Mesopotamian influence on Egyptian astrology. Arguing in favor of this, historian Tamsin Barton gives an example of what which shared two signs, the balance and the scorpion, as evidenced in the Dendera zodiac. In the Greek version, the balance was known as the scorpion's claws. After the occupation by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, Egypt came under Hellenistic rule and influence. The city of Alexandria was founded by Alexander after the conquest and during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The scholars of Alexandria were prolific writers. It was in Ptolemaic Alexandria that Babylonian astrology was mixed with Egyptian tradition of decanic astrology to create horoscopic astrology. This contained the Babylonian zodiac with its system of planetary exaltations, the triplicities of the signs, and the importance of eclipses. Along with this, it incorporated the Egyptian concept of dividing the zodiac into 36 decans of 10 degrees each, with an emphasis on the rising decan, the Greek system of planetary gods, sign rulership, and 4 elements. Sometime around 280 BC, Berossus, a priest of Baal from Babylon, moved to the Greek island of Kos in order to teach astrology and Babylonian culture to the Greeks. With this, what historian Nicholas Campion calls the innovative energy in astrology moved west to the Hellenistic world of Greece and Egypt. According to Campion, the astrology that arrived from the Eastern world was marked by its complexity, with different forms of astrology emerging. Astromancers. The earliest zodiac found in Egypt dates to the 1st century BC, the Dendera zodiac. Particularly important in the development of horoscopic astrology was the astrologer and astronomer Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt. Ptolemy's work, the Tetrabiblos, laid the basis of the Western astrological tradition, and as a source of later reference is said to have enjoyed almost the authority of a Bible among the astrological writers of 1,000 years or more. It was one of the first astrological texts to be circulated in medieval Europe after being translated from Arabic into Latin by Plato of Tivoli or Tiburtinus in Spain, 1138. Age of Inquiry. 447 BC to 432 BC. In Greece, due to its rainier climate when compared to that of Egypt, the planting season and the new year were associated with the vernal equinox, and there were temples oriented toward the rising points of certain bright stars, which warned of the sun's approach to this point. The Parthenon, for example, faced the rising of Pleiades. The waning age, the distancing of church. Despite such prohibitions, Dorothy M. Murdoch, a proponent of the study, has released books on the subject and teaches the connections between the solar allegory and the life of Christ. She also goes beyond the astronomical comparisons and postulates ties between the origins of many of the early Abrahamic religions to ancient mythologies of that in Egypt, Rome, and Greece. Oops. All right. On to the Zodiac Killer. Now we can see that the zodiacs are used to see what a person's future beholds, whether that be money, love, the kingdom, or what have you. So, the Zodiac Killer. This is criminalminds.fandom.com. I like killing people because it is so much fun, said the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer, also referred to as the Zodiac or simply Zodiac, was an enigmatic serial killer active in California in the late 1960s and 1970s. As infamous as he was, he only has a confirmed body count of 5, though he is suspected of committing as many as 37 murders in total. Name is Gary Francis Post. Alias, the Zodiac Killer, the Zodiac, or the Red Phantom. Gender, male. Pathology, serial killer, possibly a cop killer, possibly once a rapist. Calling the police after attacking his victims originally. Modus operandi, shooting, stabbing, strangulation, arson. Number of victims 5 to 37, 2 to 4 attempted. The span of crimes December 20th, 1968, October 11, 1969, June 4th, 1963, through December 22nd, 1973. First attacks and letters. The first known confirmed Zodiac murders took place on December 20th, 1960. Victims were David Arthur Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen. The Zodiac then remained inactive until July 4th, 19, and Darlene Farron, 22, while they were seated in a parked car on the parking lot of the Blue Rock Springs in Vallejo. Magoo, I don't know if I know I'm messing it up. Magoo survived, though he suffered severe injuries and was able to provide a description. On August 1st, the Vallejo Times Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the San Francisco Chronicle received near identical letters from the Zodiac in which he took guilt by stating several facts about the crime scenes, such as what the victims were wearing, how their bodies were positioned, and what brand of ammunition he used. The only signature was the Zodiac's symbol. The letters also contained one part of a three-part cipher designed by the Zodiac, who ordered all three papers to publish the ciphers on their front pages and threatened to go on a killing spree over the weekend if they didn't comply. All three papers published a cipher, which was cracked after a little more than a week by teachers Donald and Betty Hardin. In the decoded message, the Zodiac claimed to have been killing in order to collect slaves for his afterlife. The next Zodiac letter came the day before the cipher was cracked. In it, the Zodiac named himself for the first time and gave more details about the murders. The next murder took place near Lake Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, were tied up and stabbed instead of shot. Days later, during his next killing, the Zodiac diverged from his pattern even further and shot and killed a cab driver, Paul Lee Stein, 29, in Presidio Heights in San Francisco on October 11th after riding with him. This time, a partial fingerprint and blood was found inside the car, along with a pair of gloves, which were, however, considered to be too small to fit the man described by the witnesses. They were later linked to a female passenger of Stein. At first, the police were led to believe that the killer was black, which was later corrected. Before that, however, a pair of uniformed cops on their way to the crime scene spotted a man fitting the Zodiac's description, dressed in a dark jacket and walking away from the crime scene mere minutes after the shooting. 3 days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter in which the Zodiac threatened to kill all the passengers of a school bus and included a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. Though this was the last of the Zodiac's confirmed killings, he continued writing letters and claimed responsibility for several murders during this time. It is generally believed that he lied for attention. The prime suspect in this case, at least in the eyes of the public, was and remains Arthur Leigh Allen. The authorities began investigating him after they were told by one of his old co-workers, Donald Shaney, that Allen had told him about an idea he had for a novel about a serial killer who called himself Zodiac and did several things the Zodiac killer did or threatened to do, such as taping a flashlight to his gun and killing the passengers of the school bus. Though this story has been met with some skepticism in the present, since Allen was accused of molesting one of Shaney's sons. Also, Allen was a skin diver who had been to Lake Berryessa on several occasions. He also admitted to having had bloody knives in his car on the weekend of the stabbing, but claimed that the blood came from a chicken he had killed for dinner. After a warrant for his trailer and handwriting was secured and carried out, his fingerprints were compared to the partial from the cab, his guns compared to the Zodiac evidence, and his handwriting to that of the letters. None of the tests came back a match, and Allen was let go. In 1991, Magoo was tracked down and shown a lineup of old photos of Zodiac suspects. After he fingered Allen as the killer, there were talks about formally charging him with the murders based on circumstantial evidence against him, which were in turn heavily contested by others. Allen died of natural causes before any trial could take place. To this day, the case remains unsolved and the Zodiac Killer's identity is still unknown. The Zodiac is known to have sent many cryptographic, taunting, and puzzling letters to the authorities, the press, and famed lawyer Melvin Belly. In these letters, the Zodiac made his intentions and wishes known, as well as allegedly his state of mind. In some, he would include odd drawings, mosaics of photos, and astrological charts. The first letters included a cipher which he claimed hid his identity. It eventually revealed a disturbing piece where he clarified his motivations, but it didn't include anything that could be identified as a name. Below are some of the letters the Zodiac sent to the SFPD and the local newspapers. To date, almost none of his ciphers have been definitively solved. The exceptions are the initial 408 character cipher, which was solved not long after the newspapers received it by Donald Hardin, a high school history teacher, and Salinas and his wife Betty Hardin, and the so-called 340 cipher, which was solved in 2020 by David Orenchak, an American software engineer, Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician, and Jarl van Icke, a Belgian computer programmer. So, from the accounts of the few survivors of known Zodiac attacks, it is generally believed that the Zodiac dressed in black clothing of various types depending on the month, and at least on one occasion wore a dark hood decorated with the Zodiac symbol. His methods varied also, with some victims being dispatched by an automatic pistol of several types or bladed weapons, most notably what was probably a military style knife. According to one of his letters, he, during the Christmas killings, had a pencil sized flashlight taped to his gun in order to be able to shoot in the dark. The Zodiac's usual pattern of attack was to target Caucasian teenage couples, strike when they were in some secluded area, mostly lovers' lanes, and or in a car, and kill them by either shooting them or stabbing them with a knife. His method of approaching them is known to have varied. When he attacked Magoo and Farron, he just walked up to the car and started shooting at them without saying a word. While during the Hartnell Shepard stabbing, he approached them pretending to be a robber before instructing Shepard to tie up Hartnell with some pre-cut lengths of rope and then tying her up himself. During the latter killing, he claimed to be an escaped convict who had killed a guard and needed their car and money so he could flee to Mexico. When he killed Paul Stein, he got into his taxi, shot himself in the head with a 9mm, took his wallet, car keys, and a bloodied piece of his shirt, the latter of which he would later send to the Chronicle. He also most likely intentionally acted in locations where jurisdictions overlapped as a mean of slowing down the authorities. In one of his letters, he claimed to have killed some of his victims by fire and by rope. Though cases involving strangulation were linked to the Zodiac, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders, no cases involving arson were ever linked to him. Something about those beady eyes. So let's go over a movie. So this is the 7. Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman starred in here. So 7 is a 1995 American detective psychological thriller film written by Andrew Kevin Walker and directed by David Fincher. The film stars Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman with Gwyneth Paltrow, R. Lee Ermey, John C. McGinley, and Kevin Spacey in supporting roles. The newly transferred David Mills, Pitt, and the soon-to-retire William Somerset Freeman are homicide detectives who become deeply involved in the case of a sadistic serial killer, Spacey, whose meticulously planned murders correspond to the 7 deadly sins: gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, pride, lust, and envy. The film was released in the United States on September 22nd, 1995, grossing $327 million at the box office. International reviews. The plot. The events of the movie happen in the span of 7 days. Bible. On Monday, the detectives discover an obese man who was forced to feed himself to death, representing gluttony. The next day, they discover a fatal blow. Detectives find a set of fingerprints as well as additional clues at both murder scenes and believe they're chasing a serial killer. Fingerprints leads them to an apartment where they find an emaciated man strapped to a bed. Though he initially appears to be dead, it soon is discovered that then by the killer for exactly 1 year to the day, a drug dealer and a child molester before his captivity. This victim represents Sloth. Though unable to learn anything from the insensate victim, the detectives agree that the killer has planned these crimes for more than a year. Tracy Mills is unhappy with their recent move to the city. She meets Somerset after the first 2 murders, and he becomes Tracy's confidant. Upon learning that she is pregnant but has not told her husband, Somerset confides in her his fear that the city is no place to start a family and reveals that he had ended a relationship years earlier after pursuing his girlfriend to have an abortion. Somerset advises her to not tell Mills if she plans to have an abortion. Otherwise, if she decides to keep the child, get every chance you get. How do you? Let's see. Okay. What do I want to do? Okay, let's go back to the sacrifice of the firstborn. See what other information. All right. Okay, so here we're still referring to the Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, where they burned their sons and daughters in the fire, something that the Most High did not command, nor did it enter his mind. So the third reference is Jeremiah 19:5. They have built the high places of Baal to burn their children in the fire as offerings to Baal, something I did not command or mention, nor did it enter my mind. According to the final form of the text, these are the utterances of Yahweh against the practice of child sacrifice by the people of Israel. According to the prophetic voice, these are the cruel activities of the people that caused Yahweh to punish the Israelites. Scholars try to connect these references with the Yahweh's claim of the firstborn in the Pentateuchal literature. This was mainly due to the demand of Yahweh for the firstborn and the association of the Israelites with the child sacrifice, though the authors of the text try to project it as a product of religious syncretism. The authors of these texts clearly express four facts about the child sacrifices in general. One, there were places where children were sacrificed to idols. Two, there were deities who received or demanded child sacrifices. These sacrifices were practiced in the high places. Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom was prominent. According to the Deuteronomical text, this practice is a violation of what Yahweh had commanded them in Deuteronomy 18:10 and 2 Kings 23:10, and confirms that this is something Yahweh dissociates from himself and pronounces severe punishment upon the people. It is to be noted, as McCain observes, that the language used here strongly affirms that the practice was something which Yahweh did not command and which he could never have contemplated. However, it is clear that the worshippers of Yahweh were offering these sacrifices to him without realizing that they are doing something their God did not approve. That means there were misunderstandings among the people about the child sacrifice, or the writers of the Hebrew Bible misunderstood the whole concept of child sacrifice or sacrifice in general. The four probabilities could be: one, the younger generation were not aware of the warnings of the law of Moses regarding the sacrifice of children and to abhor from the practices of their neighbors, since the people around them did it for their gods. Some of the people of Israel also did it to please their God, Yahweh, thinking that this is what they also need to do for their God to get his blessings. The younger generation did know that this was something wrong, but were influenced by their neighbors and friends and joined them in the community celebration and were practicing what their friends were doing. This is a sociological aspect for any society. They would have ignored the commands of the prophets and the law of Moses. This is true even in modern society in relation to many things and practices of everyday life. There is a possibility of different kinds of Yahweh worship among the people of the Hebrew Bible. One of the options is child sacrifice, and people performed it as would anybody else in this ancient cultural context. The writers of the Hebrew Bible considered child sacrifice as something abominable during the post-exilic period. Many people, including national leaders, did practice child sacrifice in the past, though the text clearly states that they were worshiping other gods. That means Israelite religion was polytheistic, though there were people who practiced monotheism. It was the scribes, together with the influence of the elite, who eradicated polytheism and made a monotheistic society. Though one may find some glimpses of child sacrifice to Yahweh when one closely studies the text of the Hebrew Bible, it does not support this interpretation. The authors of the Hebrew text may have had some ideological or theological motive in the way they presented Yahwism to their audience. When a modern reader takes the text as it is, one may not find evidence that the Yahwism of the Hebrew Bible was against any kind of child sacrifice. The key argument connecting Yahweh with child sacrifice is mainly based on the usage of the Hebrew verb malak. The verb is consistently used in the Molech cult sacrifice for giving a person or a child to the deity. The same verb is used in the context of Yahweh's demand of the firstborn in Exodus 13 and 12. Though there is no firstborn connection in relation to the Molech cult sacrifice in the book of Jeremiah, there is a clear connection in Micah 6 and 7. which reads, "Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" Micah 6 and 7 seems to imply that the sacrifice of children in general, firstborn in particular, was practiced among the people of Israel, though the purpose may have been different from the other common sacrifices. It is to be noted that child sacrifice was not a regular sacrifice as that of other common animal or grain sacrifices. It was administered as a last resort for bringing a solution to the gravest of issues and most critical of problems. According to the record from Micah, it was offered for the appeasement of their unpardonable transgressions. This means that people sacrificed their children to receive forgiveness for their sins and wrongdoings. According to the prophetic voice, they did it for the remission of their sins, though eventually, according to the text, it brought forth curses from the God of the Hebrew Bible. The Micah passage is rhetorical in style, expecting a strong and opposing negative answer. This shows that people were offering their firstborn, which was not what God desired. It was something he hated and poured out his anger on. There is a strong condemnation of child sacrifice in many texts of the Hebrew Bible. A key passage in the prophetic books is found in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 through 26. This reference opens with different questions and issues in terms of firstborn and their sacrifice. The passage reads, "So I gave them other statutes that were not good and laws through which they could not live. I defiled them through their gifts, the sacrifice of every firstborn, that I might fill them with horror, so they would know that I am the Lord." According to the text, it is Yahweh who gave them the laws that are not good. This means that the demand for the firstborn is something Yahweh gives to punish the people. In other words, sacrificing their firstborn is not what Yahweh wants them to do, though it was He that gave the law and asked for the firstborn to be sacrificed. Discernment. According to the prophetic voices of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the practice of child sacrifice was not part of Yahweh worship, but rather they arise because of the people's nature to adopt practices of other culture and violation of the law given to them. Greenberg thinks that it is a rhetorical style of exaggeration. He comments that unique to our passage is the fusion of terms drawn from the firstborn law with that of burning children, resulting in the unprecedented and incredible charge that Israelites regularly offered up every firstborn as sacrifice, a manifest exaggeration. In this context, Ezekiel is pointing out that the child sacrifice is a sort of ultimate proof of Israel's wickedness, a defilement incurred by their worship itself. According to the authors, this leads Yahweh to let them experience these painful things. Here, it is not Yahweh who gave them the laws that they are unable to follow, but rather their actions and behaviors lead Yahweh to allow them to follow their choice. For example, Erod comments that nevertheless it shows a profound understanding of the divine reality so unsparingly portrayed by the prophet. Israel's faith in God, unable as it was to accept either the seriousness of the demand for a decision or the life-giving kindness of her God, had to experience the shock of finding herself wrong in her overconfident assumption of how God would behave before she could be touched by any awareness of the mysterious holiness of God. Rabbi Fish observes that according to the Hebrew grammatical usage, the verb I gave in this context must be interpreted as I caused to give. This is a rhetorical style of Ezekiel. The people's action leads God to act to punish them. In other words, man's disobedience in following the statutes of God made them harder to follow the laws of God. God allowed the pervasive nature of man in indulging in painful actions that they thought as good things, though it was not asked for or allowed by their God. Though it is the children who are undergoing the pain the parents undergo is also considered to be a punishment from God for their disobedience and hardened hearts. Thus, we need to understand that the law became bad due to the disobedience of the people. The good law was interpreted in a wrong way. God asked to redeem or consecrate the firstborn, whereby people indulged in sacrificing their children. This good law became bad law for them. In other words, here the law of sanctification of the firstborn in Exodus 13:2 turned to a law of pollution and killing. Referring to Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 through 26, Joyce argues that Ezekiel, as he did elsewhere, seems to connect Israelite observance of child sacrifice with the worship of alien gods and idols. This is again true in the whole understanding of God and his deed according to the text of the Hebrew Bible. Yahweh makes his law, which is otherwise celebrated as light and a way of life. The occasion of punishment is unique in the Hebrew Bible. After looking at the Ezekiel passage, Hyder argues that it is a polemic attack of the prophet to the people who are in apostasy. He observes the result of Israel's refusal to obey Yahweh, as it was for Pharaoh, and the death of the firstborn, only this time at the willing hands of the rebels themselves. Jensen notes that Ezekiel now calls child sacrifice a sort of ultimate proof of Israel's wickedness, a defilement incurred by their worship itself, and a command to perform it in an ordinance that does not promote life. But God also says that it is he who gave the command. Jensen provides a reason that he did it to punish Israel for inveterate rebellion by driving them into rebellion's final depth, into sheer horror, where they might finally acknowledge their desperate situation. Greenberg also agrees with this idea, stating because Israel consistently rejected God's good, life-giving laws, God's condign punishment was to replace them with not good laws by observing which one would gain not life but death. This is true if one compares it with other prophetic utterances where people were hardening their minds, like in Isaiah 6:9. A similar situation is found in Isaiah 63:17, which reads, "Why, Yahweh, do you made us stray from your ways and harden our hearts not to fear you?" However, one also should consider the way people wrongly interpreted the law of the firstborn. There could have been different groups who believed in the literal practice of the demand of the firstborn, even if not every firstborn. This should be understood in the light of Stracopolo's interpretation of various religious traditions or practices among people. The prophet could have been speaking from a point of theodicy and might have been basing his understanding on the demand to offer every firstborn to Yahweh. Ezekiel chapter 20, 25 through 26 is the prophetic interpretation of the law of the firstborn, condemning the firstborn sacrifice, arguing that this sacrifice was given to them by Yahweh to be practiced. Hence, the text revealed that people were offering their firstborn even in the worship of other gods and idols, such as Baal, or in the personified sacrifice of Molech or Yahweh. For Ezekiel, child sacrifice is an abomination, and Yahweh is neither pleased with it nor accepts it. These passages clearly imply, however, that it was Yahweh who gave these commands, perhaps referring to Yahweh's demand for the firstborn. This is the bad law according to the prophetic voice. It was intended for good, but turned bad by its wrong usage and interpretation by the people in sacrificing their children, perhaps even for Yahweh. People thought they were doing a good thing, as did the worshipers of other gods. In response, the prophets stated clearly that it was not the will of Yahweh and that child sacrifice was something practiced by other people in relation to the people of Israel, though Israelites also practiced it. The evidence is substantial, however, that children were sacrificed in the Molech sacrifice. One needs to consider the relation between Yahweh's demand for the firstborn and the Molech sacrifice. The central question is, are they same or different? John Day, in his concluding remarks, states, "It may be confidently asserted that the Molech sacrifices are not to be equated with the offering of the firstborn to Yahweh in any case. These two are entirely different in every respect for the following reasons. Yahweh demands only the firstborn, and even in this, he is not demanding that they are sacrificed. The people of Israel had done so at some point in their history, which prophets and the writers of the Hebrew Bible publicly attacked. In the Molech cult, however, there is no exclusive demand for the firstborn. The victim can be any child, including the firstborn." The following Hebrew Bible text affirms this. Leviticus 18:21 reads, "You shall not give any of your children to devote them by fire to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." This means Molech receives any child, not just the firstborn. Leviticus 22-5, "Say to the people of Israel, any man of the people of Israel or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech shall be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people, because he has given one of his children to Molech, defiling my sanctuary and profaning my holy name. And if the people of the land do at all hide their eyes from that man, when he gives one of his children to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his family, and will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in playing the harlot after Molech." There is a provision of redemption in Yahweh's demand for the firstborn. In Molech's sacrifice, there is no thought of redemption. Redeem with the lamb every firstborn donkey, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. Yahweh did not ask for the female firstborn or any other children outside the firstborn male, whereas in the Molech cult, girls were also sacrificed. 2 Kings 23:10 reads, "And he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech." Jeremiah 32:35 states, "They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and daughters to Molech, though I did not command them, nor did it enter into my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin." For the prophets reject all kinds of child and human sacrifices with strong words, even regarding dedicating girls to the temples. It is to be noted that Yahweh's demand for the firstborn and the Molech sacrifice of children cannot be equated. The Hebrew Bible writers were aware of the practice of child sacrifice in different contexts. It seems that during the time of the prophets, it could have been a widespread practice among the people of the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps people would have been performing it thinking this was something their God demanded and was pleased with. However, the prophetic voices were against the common practice of the people, condemning it as an act of apostasy and urging them to leave it and return to the true form of worship. This indicates that there is a possibility of an official and popular religious trend among the people, as observed by Stavrokopoulou. The literature of the Hebrew Bible varies in its presentation of the practice of what is official and what is not. There are times when kings and the royal cult approved of child sacrifices as part of the official religion. During those times, some prophets and priests stood against it. There are other times where the kings were against all forms of idol worship and sacrifices. During these times, the priests and prophets who supported child sacrifice stood against the monarchs. This was a repeating pattern. As these two opposing groups persecuted each other, the supporters of the official religion persecuted the popular practice since they had both the power and authority. This is a commonly observed phenomenon in many cultures. The wider context of each reference to child sacrifice and Molech sacrifice reveals the writer's disapproval of the practices rather than its approval. The aim of the writer was polemic, attacking these practices and calling the people to return to their God. The prophets informed them of their apostasy and the impending punishment from their deity if they did not turn back. Scholarship agrees with the point that there was not a single editor of the Hebrew Bible. There is a possibility of many different editors editing different portions of the Hebrew Bible at different times. Nevertheless, the entire Hebrew text unanimously abhors and totally rejects the practice of child sacrifice by the Israelites in their worship of Yahweh. There is evidence of child sacrifice in the worship of Yahweh. This means that there was a wrong understanding either among the religious officials, the population, or the authors of the Bible. Okay. Turn it. Let's go to the golden bow or golden bow. That Kindle. One second. Oh. Oh, darn. Okay. All right, 1 second. Wrong account. Switch. my books. Okay. So the Golden Bow, that book is down in the description box. We are reading The Burning of Human Effigies. I think that's how that's pronounced. Okay, the burning of effigies and the fires. So we have still to ask, what is the meaning of burning effigies in the fire at these festivals? After the preceding investigation, the answer to the question seems obvious. As the fires are often alleged to be kindled for the purpose of burning the witches, and as the effigy burnt in them is sometimes called the witch, we might naturally be disposed to conclude that all the effigies consumed in the flames on these occasions represent witches or warlocks, and that the custom of burning them is merely a substitute for burning the wicked men and women themselves. Since, on the principle of homeopathic or imitative magic, you practically destroy the witch herself in destroying her effigy. On the whole, this explanation of the burning of straw figures in human shape at the festivals is perhaps the most probable. Yet it may be this explanation does not apply to all the cases, and that certain of them may admit and even require another interpretation. For the effigies so burned, as I have already remarked, can hardly be separated from the effigies of death, which are burned or otherwise destroyed in spring. And grounds have been already given for regarding the so-called effigies of death as really representatives of the tree spirit of or spirit of vegetation. Are the other effigies which are burned in the spring and midsummer bonfires susceptible of the same explanation? It would seem so. For just as the fragments of the so-called death are stuck in the fields to make the crops grow, so the charred embers of the figure burned in the spring bonfires are sometimes laid on the fields in the belief that they will keep vermin from the crop. Again, the rule that the last married bride must leap over the fire in which the straw man is burned on Shrove Tuesday is probably intended to make her fruitful. But as we have seen, the power of blessing women with offspring is a special attribute of tree spirits. It is therefore a fair presumption that the burning effigy over which the bride must leap is a representative of the fertilizing tree spirit or spirit of vegetation. This character of the effigy as representative of the spirit of vegetation is almost unmistakable when the figure is composed of an unthreshed sheaf of corn or is covered from head to foot with flowers. Again, it is to be noted that instead of a puppet, trees, either living or felled, are sometimes burned both in the spring and midsummer bonfires. Now, considering the frequency with which the tree spirit is represented in human shape, it is hardly rash to suppose that when sometimes a tree and sometimes an effigy is burned in these fires, the effigy and the tree are regarded as equivalent to each other, each being a representative of the tree spirit. This again is confirmed by observing first that sometimes the effigy which is to be burned is carried about simultaneously with a May tree, the former being carried by the boys, the latter by the girls. And second, that the effigy is sometimes tied to a living tree and burned with it. In these cases, we can scarcely doubt the tree spirit is represented as we have found it represented before, in duplicate both by the tree and by the effigy. That the true character of the effigy as a representative of the beneficent spirit of vegetation should sometimes be forgotten is natural. The custom of burning a beneficent god is too foreign to later modes of thought to escape misinterpretation. Naturally enough, the people who continued to burn his image came in time to identify it as the effigy of persons whom, on various grounds, they regarded with aversion, such as Judas Iscariot, Luther, and a witch. The general reasons for killing a god or his representative have been examined in a preceding chapter. But when the god happens to be a deity of vegetation, there are special reasons why he should die by fire. For light and heat are necessary to vegetable growth, and on the principle of sympathetic magic, by subjecting the personal representative of vegetation to their influence, you secure a supply of these necessaries for trees and crops. In other words, by burning the spirit of vegetation in a fire which represents the sun, you make sure that for a time at least, vegetation shall have plenty of sun. It may be objected that if the intention is simply to secure enough sunshine for vegetation, this end would be better attained on the principles of sympathetic magic by merely passing the representative of vegetation through the fire instead of burning him. In point of fact, this is sometimes done. In Russia, as we have seen, the straw figure of Kupalo is not burned in the midsummer fire, but merely carried backwards and forwards across it. But for the reasons already given, it is necessary that the god should die. So next day, Kupalo is stripped of her ornaments and thrown into a stream. In this Russian custom, the passage of the image through the fire, if it is not simply a purification, may possibly be a sun charm. The killing of the god is a separate act, and the mode of killing him by drowning is probably a rain charm. But usually people have not thought it necessary to draw this fine distinction for the various reasons already assigned. It is advantageous, they think, to expose the god of vegetation to a considerable degree of heat, and it is also advantageous to kill him, and they combine these advantages in a rough and ready way by burning him. The burning of men and animals in the fire. In the popular customs connected with the fire festivals of Europe, there are certain features which appear to point to a former practice of human sacrifice. We have seen reasons for believing that in Europe, living persons have often acted as representatives of the tree spirit and corn spirit and have suffered death as such. There is no reason, therefore, why they should not have been burned if any special advantages were likely to be attained by putting them to death in that way. The consideration of human suffering is not one which enters into the calculations of primitive man. Now, in the fire festivals which we are discussing, the pretense of burning people is sometimes carried so far that it seems reasonable to regard it as a mitigated survival of an older custom of actually burning them. Thus, in Aachen, as we saw, the man clad in pea straw acts so cleverly that the children really believe he is being burned. At Jumiges in Normandy, The man clad all in green, who bore the title of the Green Wolf, was pursued by his comrades, and when they caught him, they feigned to fling him upon the midsummer bonfire. Similarly, at the Beltane fires in Scotland, they pretended victim was seized and a show made of throwing him into the flames, and for some time afterwards, people affected to speak of him as dead. Again, in the Halloween bonfires of northeastern Scotland, we may perhaps detect a similar pretense in the custom observed by a lad of lying down as close to the fire as possible and allowing the other lads to leap over him. The titular king of Ikes. Come on now. Okay. Okay. The titular king at Aix, who reigned for a year and danced the first dance round the midsummer bonfire, may perhaps in days of old have discharged the less agreeable duty of serving as fuel for that fire, which in later times he only kindled. In the following customs, Manhart is probably right in recognizing traces of an old custom of burning a leaf-clad representative of the spirit of vegetation. At Wolfegg in Austria, on a midsummer day, a boy completely clad in green fir branches goes from house to house, accompanied by a noisy crew collecting wood for the bonfire. As he gets the wood, he sings, "Forest trees I want, no sour milk for me, but beer and wine, so can the woodman be jolly and gay." In some parts of Bavaria, also, the boys who go from house to house collecting fuel for the midsummer bonfire envelope one of their number from head to foot in green branches of firs and lead him by a rope through the whole village. At Mushim in Württemberg, the festival of St. John's fire usually lasted for 14 days, ending on the second Sunday after Midsummer Day. On this last day, the bonfire was left in charge of the children, while the older people retired to a wood. Here they encased the young fellow in leaves and twigs, who, thus disguised, went to the fire, scattered it, and trod it out. All the people present fled at the sight of him. But it seems possible to go farther than this. Of human sacrifices offered on these occasions, the most unequivocal traces, as we have seen, are those which, about 100 years ago, still lingered at the Beltane fires in the Highlands of Scotland, that is, among a Celtic people who, situated in a remote corner of Europe and almost completely isolated from foreign influence, had till then conserved their old heathenism better perhaps than any other people in the west of Europe. It is significant, therefore, that human sacrifices by fire are known on unquestionable evidence to have been systematically practiced by the Celts. The earliest description of these sacrifices has been bequeathed to us by Julius Caesar. As conqueror of the hitherto independent Celts of Gaul, Caesar had ample opportunity of observing the national Celtic religion and manners, while these were still fresh and crisp from the native mint and had not yet been fused in the melting pot of Roman civilization. With his own notes, Caesar appears to have incorporated the observations of a Greek explorer by name Posidonius, who traveled in Gaul about 50 years before Caesar carried the Roman arms to the English Channel. The Greek geographer Strabo and the historian Diodorus seem also to have derived their descriptions of the Celtic sacrifices from the work of Posidonius. But independently of each other and of Caesar, for each of the three derivative accounts contain some details which are not to be found in either of the others. By combining them, therefore, we can restore the original account of Posidonius with some probability, and thus obtain a picture of the sacrifices offered by the Celts of Gaul at the close of the 2nd century before our era. The following seem to have been the main outlines of the custom. Condemned criminals were reserved by the Celts in order to be sacrificed to the gods at a great festival which took place once in every 5 years. The more there were of such victims, the greater was believed to be the fertility of the land. If there were not enough criminals to furnish victims, captives taken in war were immolated to supply the deficiency. When the time came, the victims were sacrificed by the Druids or priests. Some they shot down with arrows, some they impaled, and some they burned alive in the following manner. Colossal images of wicker work or of wood and grass were constructed. These were filled with live men, cattle, and animals of other kinds. Fire was then applied to the images and they were burned with their living contents. Such were the great festivals held once every 5 years. But besides these quennial festivals celebrated on so grand a scale and with apparently so large an expenditure of human life, it seems reasonable to suppose that festivals of the same sort, only on a lesser scale, were held annually, and that from these annual festivals are lineally descended some at least of the fire festivals, which, with their traces of human sacrifices, are still celebrated year by year in many parts of Europe. The gigantic images constructed of osiers or covered with grass in which the Druids enclosed their victims remind us of the leafy framework in which the human representative of the tree spirit is still so often encased. Hence, seeing that the fertility of the land was apparently supposed to depend upon the due performance of these sacrifices, Manhart interpreted these Celtic victims cased in osiers and grass as representatives of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation. Excuse me. These wicker giants of the Druids seem to have had till lately, if not down to the present time, their representatives at the spring and midsummer festivals of modern Europe. At Douai, down at least to the early part of the 19th century, a procession took place annually on the Sunday nearest to the 7th of July. The great feature of the procession was a colossal figure, some 20 or 30 feet high, made of osiers and called the giant, which was moved through the streets by means of rollers and ropes worked by men who were enclosed within the effigy. The figure was armed as a knight with lance and sword, helmet and shield. Behind him marched his wife and his 3 children, all constructed of osiers on the same principle but on a smaller scale. At Dunkirk, the procession of the giants took place on Midsummer Day, the 24th of June. The festival, which was known as the Follies of Dunkirk, attracted multitudes of spectators. The giant was a huge figure of wickerwork, occasionally as much as 45 feet high, dressed in a long blue robe with gold stripes, which reached to his feet, concealing the dozen or more men who made it dance and bob its head to the spectators. This colossal effigy went by the name of Papa Roos and carried in its pocket a bouncing infant of Brobdingnagian proportions. The rear was brought up by the daughter of the giant, constructed like her sire of wickerwork and little, if at all, inferior to him in size. Most towns and even villages of Brabant and Flanders have, or used to have, similar wicker giants, which were annually led about to the delight of the populace, who loved these grotesque figures, spoke of them with patriotic enthusiasm, and never wearied of gazing at them. At Antwerp, the giant was so big that no gate in the city was large enough to let him go through. Hence, he could not visit his brother giants in neighboring towns as the other Belgian giants used to do on solemn occasions. In England, artificial giants seem to have been a standing feature of the Midsummer Festival. A writer of the 16th century speaks of midsummer pageants in London, where, to make the people wonder, are set forth great and ugly giants marching as if they were alive and armed at all points. but within they are stuffed full of brown paper and tow, which the shrewd boys, under peering, do guiltfully discover and turn to a great derision. At Chester, the annual pageant on Midsummer Eve included the effigies of 4 giants with animals, hobby horses, and other figures. At Coventry, it appears that the giant's wife figured beside the giant. At Burford, in Oxfordshire, Midsummer Eve used to be celebrated with great jollity by the carrying of a giant and a dragon up and down the town. The last survivor of these perambulating English giants lingered at Salisbury, where an antiquary found him moldering to decay in the neglected hall of the Tailors' Company about the year 1844. His bodily framework was a lock and hoop, like the one which used to be worn by Jack in the Green on May Day. In these cases, the giants merely figured in the processions, but sometimes they were burned in the summer bonfires. Thus, the people of the Rue aux Ours in Paris used annually to make a great wickerwork figure dressed as a soldier, which they promenaded up and down the streets for several days and solemnly burned on the 3rd of July. The crowd of spectators singing Salve Regina. A personage who bore the title of king presided over the ceremony with a lighted torch in his hand. The burning fragments of the image were scattered among the people, who eagerly scrambled for them. The custom was abolished in 1743. In Brie, Isle de France, a wickerwork giant 18 feet high was annually burned on Midsummer Eve. Again, the Druidical custom of burning live animals enclosed in wickerwork has its counterpart at the spring and midsummer festivals. At Lucan in the Pyrenees on Midsummer Eve, a hollow column composed of strong wickerwork is raised to the height of about 60 feet in the center of the principal suburb and interlaced with green foliage up to the very top, while the most beautiful flowers and shrubs procurable are artistically arranged in groups below so as to form a sort of background to the scene. The column is then filled with combustible materials ready for ignition. An appointed hour, about 8 p.m., a grand procession composed of the clergy, followed by young men and maidens in holiday attire, took their position around the column. Meanwhile, bonfires are lit with beautiful effect in the surrounding hills. Now thrown into the column, which is set on fire at the base by means of torches armed with gestures. The serpents, to avoid the flashing out laterally until finally obliged to drop, their struggles for life giving rise to enthusiastic delight among the surrounding spectators. This is a favorite annual ceremony for the inhabitants of Luchon and its neighborhood, and local tradition assigns it to a heathen origin. In Paris, it was the custom to burn a basket, barrel, or sack full of live cats, which was hung from a tall mast in the midst of the bonfire. Sometimes a fox was burned. The people collected the embers and ashes of the fire and took them home, believing that they brought good luck. The French kings often witnessed these spectacles and even lit the bonfire with their own hands. In 1648, Louis XIV, crowned with a wreath of roses and carrying a bunch of roses in his hand, kindled the fire, danced at it, and partook of the banquet afterwards in the town hall. But this was the last occasion when a monarch presided at the midsummer bonfire in Paris. At Metz, midsummer fires were lighted with a great pomp. Metz sounds like Met Gala. The esplanade and a dozen cats enclosed in wicker cages were burned alive in them, to the amusement of the people. Similarly, at Gap, in the department of the High Alps, Cats used to be roasted over the midsummer bonfire. In Russia, a white cock was sometimes burned in the midsummer bonfire. In Meissen or Thuringia, a horse's head used to be thrown into it. Sometimes animals are burned in the spring bonfires. In the Vosges, cats were burned on Shrove Tuesday. In Alsace, they were thrown into the Easter bonfire. In the department of the Ardennes, cats were flung into the bonfires kindled on the first Sunday in Lent. Sometimes, by a refinement of cruelty, they were hung over the fire from the end of a pole and roasted alive. The cat, which represented the devil, could never suffer enough. While the creatures were perishing in the flames, the shepherds guarded their flocks and forced them to leap over the fire, esteeming this an infallible means of preserving them from disease and witchcraft. We have seen that squirrels were sometimes burned in the Easter fire. Thus, it appears that the sacrificial rites of the Celts of ancient Gaul can be traced in the popular festivals of modern Europe. Naturally, it is in France, or rather in the wider area comprised within the limits of ancient Gaul, that these rites have left the clearest traces in the customs of burning giants of wickerwork and animals enclosed in wickerwork or baskets. These customs, it will have been remarked, are generally observed at or about midsummer. From this, we may infer that the original rites of which these are the degenerate successors were solemnized at midsummer. This inference harmonizes with the conclusion suggested by a general survey of European folk custom that the Midsummer Festival must, on the whole, have been the most widely diffused and the most solemn of all the yearly festivals celebrated by the primitive Aryans in Europe. At the same time, we must bear in mind that among the British Celts, the chief fire festivals of the year appear certainly to have been those of Beltane or May Day and Halloween, the last day of October. And this suggests a doubt whether the Celts of Gaul also may not have celebrated their principal rites of fire, including their burnt sacrifices of men and animals, at the beginning of May or the beginning of November, rather than at midsummer. We have still to ask, what is the meaning of such sacrifices? Why were men and animals burnt to death at these festivals? If we are right in interpreting the modern European fire festivals as attempts to break the power of witchcraft by burning or banning the witches, and of the Celts in the same manner, that is, we must images were condemned to death on the ground that they were witches or wizards, and that the mode of execution by fire was chosen because burning alive is deemed the surest mode of getting rid of these noxious and dangerous beings. The same explanation would apply to the cattle and wild animals of many kinds, which the Celts burned along with the men. They too, we may conjecture, were supposed to be either under the spell of witchcraft or actually to be the witches and wizards who had transformed themselves into animals for the purpose of prosecuting their infernal plots against the welfare of their fellow creatures. This conjecture is confirmed by the observation that the victims most commonly burned in modern bonfires have been cats, and that cats are precisely the animals into which, with the possible exception of hares, witches were most usually supposed to transform themselves. Again, we have seen that serpents and foxes used sometimes to be burnt in the midsummer fires, and Welsh and German witches are reported to have assumed the form both of foxes and serpents. In short, when we remember the great variety of animals whose forms witches can assume at pleasure, it seems easy on this hypothesis to account for the variety of living creatures that have been burnt at festivals both in ancient Gaul and modern Europe. All these victims, we may surmise, were doomed to the flames, not because they were animals, but because they were believed to be witches who had taken the shape of animals for their nefarious purposes. One advantage of explaining the ancient Celtic sacrifices in this way is that it introduces, as it were, a harmony and consistency into the treatment which Europe has meted out to witches from the earliest times down to about 2 centuries ago, when the growing influence of rationalism discredited the belief in witchcraft and put a stop to the custom of burning witches. Be that as it may, we can now perhaps understand why the Druids believed that the more persons they sentenced to death, the greater would be the fertility of the land. To a modern reader, the connection at first sight may not be obvious between the activity of the hanged man and the productivity of the earth, but a little reflection may satisfy him that when the criminals who perish at the stake or on the gallows are witches, whose delight it is to blight the crops of the farmer or to lay them low under storms of hail, the execution of these wretches is really calculated to ensure an abundant harvest by removing one of the principal causes which paralyze the efforts and blast the hopes of the husbandman. The Druidical sacrifices which we are considering were explained in a different way by W. Manhart. He supposed that the men whom the Druids burned in wickerwork images represented the spirits of vegetation, and accordingly that the custom of burning them was a magical ceremony intended to secure the necessary sunshine for the crops. Similarly, he seems to have inclined to the view that the animals which used to be burnt in the bonfires represented the corn spirit, which, as we saw in an earlier part of this work, is often supposed to assume the shape of an animal. This theory is no doubt tenable, titles it to careful look, but on reconsideration, it seems to me on the whole to be less probable than the theory that the men and animals burnt in the fires perished in the character of witches. This latter view is strongly supported by the testimony of the people who celebrate the fire festivals, since a popular name for the custom of kindling the fires is burning the witches. Effigies of witches are sometimes consumed in the flames, and the fires, their embers, or their ashes are supposed to furnish protection against witchcraft. On the other hand, there is little to show that the effigies or the animals burnt in the fires are regarded by the people as representatives of the vegetation spirit, and that the bonfires are sun charms. With regard to serpents in particular, which used to be burnt in the midsummer fire at Lushan, I am not aware of any certain evidence that in Europe snakes have been regarded as embodiments of the tree spirit or corn spirit, though in other parts of the world the conception appears to be not unknown. Whereas popular faith in the transformation of witches into animals is so general and deeply rooted, and the fear of these uncanny beings is so strong, that it seems safer to suppose that the cats and other animals which were burnt in the fire suffered death as embodiments of witches than they perished as representatives of vegetation spirits. Balder and the mistletoe. The reader may remember that the preceding account of the popular fire festivals of Europe was suggested by the myth of the Norse god Balder, who is said to have been slain by a branch of mistletoe and burnt in a great fire. We have now to inquire how far the customs which have been passed in review help to shed light on the myth. In this inquiry, it may be convenient to begin with the mistletoe, the instrument of Balder's death. From the immemorial, the mistletoe has been the object of superstitious veneration in Europe. It was worshipped by the Druids. After enumerating the different kinds of mistletoe, he proceeds. In treating of this subject, the admiration in which the mistletoe is held throughout Gaul ought not to pass unnoticed. The Druids, for so they called their wizards, esteemed nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree on which it grows, provided only that the tree is an oak, which is the symbol of the tree of life. But apart from this, they choose oak woods for their sacred groves and perform no sacred rites without oak leaves, so that the very name of Druids may be regarded as a Greek appellation derived from their worship of the oak. For they believe that whatever grows on these trees is sent from heaven and is a sign that the tree has been chosen by the God himself. The mistletoe is very rarely to be met with, but when it is found, they gather it with solemn ceremony. This they do above all on the sixth day of the moon, from whence they date the beginnings of their months, of their years, and of their 30-year cycle. Because by the sixth day, the moon has plenty of vigor and has not run half its course. After due preparations have been made for a sacrifice and a feast under the tree, they hail it as the universal healer and bring to the spot two white bulls whose horns have never been bound before. A priest clad in white robe climbs the tree and with a golden sickle cuts the mistletoe, which is caught in a white cloth. Then they sacrifice the victims, praying that God may make his own gift to prosper with those upon whom he has bestowed it. They believe that a portion prepared from mistletoe will make barren animals to bring forth, and that the plant is a remedy against all poison. In another passage, Pliny tells us that in medicine, the mistletoe which grows on an oak was esteemed the most efficacious, and that its efficacy was by some superstitious people supposed to be increased if the plant was gathered on the first day of the moon without the use of iron, and if when gathered it was not allowed to touch the earth. Oak mistletoe thus obtained was deemed a cure for epilepsy. Carried about by women, it assisted them to conceive, and it healed ulcers most effectually, if only the sufferer chewed a piece of the plant and laid another piece on the sore. Yet again, he says that mistletoe was supposed, like vinegar and an egg, to be an excellent means of extinguishing a fire. If in these latter passages Pliny refers, as he apparently does, to the beliefs current among his contemporaries in Italy, it will follow that the Druids and the Italians were to some extent agreed as to the valuable properties possessed by mistletoe, which grows on an oak. Both of them deemed it an effectual remedy for a number of ailments, and both of them ascribed to it a quickening virtue. The Druids believing that a potion prepared from mistletoe would fertilize barren cattle, and the Italians holding that a piece of mistletoe carried about by a woman would help her to conceive a child. Further, both peoples thought that if the plant were to exert its medicinal properties, it must be gathered in a certain way and at a certain time. It might not be cut with iron, hence the Druids cut it with gold, and it might not touch the earth. Hence, the Druids caught it in a white cloth. In choosing the time for gathering the plant, both they differed as to the particular day of the moon, the Italians preferring the first and the Druids and Italians as to the wonderful medicinal properties of mistletoe. We may compare the similar beliefs of the modern Aino of Japan. We read that they, like many nations of the northern origin, hold the mistletoe in peculiar veneration. They look upon it as a medicine, good in almost every disease, and it is sometimes taken in food and at others separately as a decoction. The leaves are used in preference to the berries, the latter being of too sticky a nature for general purposes, but many too suppose this plant to have the power of making the gardens bear plentifully. When used for this purpose, the leaves are cut up into fine pieces and after seeds, a little also being eaten with the food, to be made to bear children. That mistletoe which grows upon the willow is supposed to have the greatest efficacy. This is because the willow is looked upon by them as being an especially sacred tree. Thus, the Aino agree with the Druids in regarding mistletoe as a cure for almost every disease, and they agree with the ancient Italians that applied to women, it helps them to bear children. Again, the Druidical notion that the mistletoe was an all healer or panacea may be compared with a notion entertained by the Wallows of Senegambia. These people have much veneration for a sort of mistletoe which they call toad. They carry leaves of it on their persons when they go to war as a preservative against wounds, just as if the leaves were real talismans or grease. The French writer who records this practice adds, "It is not very curious that the mistletoe should be in this part of Africa what it was in the superstitions of the Gauls. This prejudice common to the two countries may have the same origin. Blacks and whites will doubtless have seen, each of them for themselves, something supernatural in a plant which grows and flourishes without having roots in the earth. May they not have believed, in fact, that it was a plant fallen from the sky, a gift of the divinity?" This suggestion as to the origin of the superstition is strongly confirmed by the Druidical belief reported by Pliny that whatever grew on an oak was sent from heaven and was a sign that the tree had been chosen by the god himself. Such a belief explains why the Druids cut the mistletoe not with a common knife but with a golden sickle, and why, when cut, it was not suffered to touch the earth. Probably they thought that the celestial plant would have been profaned and its marvelous virtue lost by contact with the ground. With the ritual observed by the Druids in cutting the mistletoe, we may compare the ritual which in Cambodia is prescribed in a similar case. They say that when you see an orchard growing as a parasite on a tamarind tree, you should dress it in white. Take a new earthenware pot, then climb the tree at noon, break off the plant, put it in the pot, and let the pot fall to the ground. After that, you make in the pot a decoction which confers the gift of invulnerability. Thus, just as in Africa, the leaves of one parasitic plant are supposed to render the wearer invulnerable, so in Cambodia, a decoction made from another parasitic plant is considered to render the same service to such as make use of it, whether by drinking or washing. We may conjecture that in both places, the notion of invulnerability is suggested by the position of the plant, which occupying a place of comparative security above the ground appears to promise to its fortunate possessor a similar security from some of the ills that beset the life of man on earth. We have already met with examples of the store which the primitive mind sets on such vantage grounds. Whatever may be the origin of these beliefs and practices concerning the mistletoe, certain it is that some of them have their analogies in the folklore of modern European peasants. For example, it is laid down as a rule in various parts of Europe that mistletoe may not be cut in the ordinary way, but must be shot or knocked down with stones from the tree on which it is growing. Thus, in the Swiss canton of Argua, all parasitic plants are esteemed in a certain sense holy by the country folk, but most particularly so the mistletoe growing on an oak. They ascribe great powers to it, but shrink from cutting it off in the usual manner. Instead of that, they procure it in the following manner. When the sun is in Sagittarius and the moon is on the wane, on the first, third, or fourth day before the new moon, one ought to shoot down with an arrow the mistletoe of an oak and to catch it with the left hand as it falls. Such mistletoe is a remedy for every ailment of children. Here, among the Swiss peasants, as among the Druids of old, special virtue is ascribed to mistletoe which grows on an oak. It may not be cut in the usual way, it must be caught as it falls to the ground. And it is esteemed a panacea for all diseases, at least of children. In Sweden, also, it is a popular superstition that if mistletoe is to possess its peculiar virtue, it must either be shot down out of the oak or knocked down with stones. Similarly, so late as the early part of the 19th century, People in Wales believed that for the mistletoe to have any power, it must be shot or struck down with stones off the tree where it grew. Again, in respect of the healing virtues of mistletoe, the opinion of modern peasants and even of the learned has to some extent agreed with that of the ancients. The Druids appear to have called the plant, or perhaps the oak on which it grew, the all healer, and all healer is said to be still a name of the mistletoe in the modern Celtic speech of Brittany, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. On St. John's morning, midsummer morning, peasants of Piedmont and Lombardy go out to search the oak leaves for the oil of St. John, which is supposed to heal all wounds made with cutting instruments. Originally, perhaps the oil of St. John was simply the mistletoe or a decoction made from it. For in Holstein, the mistletoe, especially oak mistletoe, is still regarded as a panacea for green wounds and as a sure charm to secure success in hunting. And at Lacan, in the south of France, the old druidical belief in the mistletoe as an antidote to all poisons still survives among the peasantry. They apply the plant to the stomach of the sufferer or give him a decoction of it to drink. Again, the ancient belief that mistletoe is a cure for epilepsy has survived in modern times, not only among the ignorant, but among the learned. Thus, in Sweden, persons afflicted with the falling sickness think they can ward off attacks of the malady by carrying about with them a knife which has a handle of oak mistletoe. And in Germany, for a similar purpose, pieces of mistletoe used to be hung round the necks of children. In the French province of Bourbonnais, a popular remedy for epilepsy is a decoction of mistletoe which has been gathered on an oak on St. John's Day and boiled with rye flour. So at Botsford in Lincolnshire, a decoction of mistletoe is supposed to be a palliative for this terrible disease. Instead, mistletoe was recommended as a remedy for the falling sickness by high medical authorities in England and Holland down to the 18th century. However, the opinion of the medical profession as to the curative virtues of mistletoe has undergone a radical alteration. Whereas the Druids thought that mistletoe cured everything, modern doctors appear to think that it cures nothing. If they are right, we must conclude that the ancient and widespread faith in the medicinal virtue of mistletoe is a pure superstition based on nothing better than the fanciful inferences which ignorance has drawn from the parasitic nature of the plant, its position high up on the branch of a tree seeming to protect it from the dangers to which plants and animals are subject on the surface of the ground. From this point of view, we can perhaps understand why mistletoe has so long and so persistently been prescribed as a cure for the falling sickness. As mistletoe cannot fall to the ground because it is rooted on the branch of a tree high above the earth, it seems to follow as a necessary consequence that an epileptic patient cannot possibly fall down in a fit so long as he carries a piece of mistletoe in his pocket or a decoction of mistletoe in his stomach. Such a train of reasoning would probably be regarded even now as cogent by a large portion of the human species. Again, the ancient Italian opinion that mistletoe extinguishes fire appears to be shared by Swedish peasants, who hang up branches of oak mistletoe on the ceilings of their rooms as a protection against harm in general and conflagration in particular. A hint as to the way in which mistletoe comes to be possessed of this property is furnished by the epithet thunderbosom, which people of the Argau canton in Switzerland apply to the plant. For a thunderbosom is a shaggy, bushy excrescence on branches of trees, which is popularly believed to be produced by a flash of lightning. Hence, in Bohemia, a thunderbosom burnt in the fire protects the house against being struck by a thunderbolt. Being itself a product of lightning, it naturally serves on homeopathic principles as a protection against lightning, in fact, as a kind of lightning conductor. Hence, the fire witch mistletoe in Sweden is designed especially to avert from houses, may be fire kindled by lightning, though no doubt the plant is equally effective against conflagration in general. Again, mistletoe acts as a mastery key as well as a lightning conductor, for it is said to open all locks. But perhaps the most precious of all the virtues of mistletoe is that it affords efficient protection against sorcery and witchcraft. That, no doubt, is the reason why in Austria a twig of mistletoe is laid on the threshold as a preventive of nightmare. And it may be the reason why in the north of England they say that if you wish your dairy to thrive, you should give your bunch of mistletoe to the first cow that calves after New Year's Day. For it is well known that nothing is so fatal to milk and butter as witchcraft. Similarly, in Wales, for the sake of ensuring good luck to the dairy, people used to give a branch of mistletoe to the first cow that gave birth to a calf after the first hour of the new year. And in rural districts of Wales, where mistletoe abounded, there was always a profusion of it in the farmhouses. When mistletoe was scarce, Welsh farmers used to say, "No mistletoe, no luck." But if there was a fine crop of mistletoe, they expected a fine crop of corn. In Sweden, mistletoe is diligently sought after on St. John's Eve, the people believing it to be in a high degree possessed of mystic qualities, and that if a sprig of it be attached to the ceiling of the dwelling house, the horse's stall, or the cow's crib, the troll will then be powerless to injure either man or beast. With regard to the time when the mistletoe should be gathered, opinions have varied. The Druids gathered it above all on the sixth day of the moon, the ancient Italians apparently on the first day of the moon. In modern times, some have preferred the full moon of March, and others the waning moon of winter when the sun is in Sagittarius. But the favorite time would seem to be Midsummer Eve or Midsummer Day. We have seen that both in France and Sweden, special virtues are ascribed to mistletoe gathered at midsummer. The rule in Sweden is that mistletoe must be cut on the night of Midsummer Eve when sun and moon stand in the sign of their might. Again, in Wales, it was believed that a sprig of mistletoe gathered on St. John's Eve or Midsummer Eve, or at any time before the berries appeared, would induce dreams of omen, both good and bad, if it were placed under the pillow of the sleeper. Thus, mistletoe is one of the many plants whose magical or medicinal virtues are believed to culminate with the culmination of the sun on the longest day of the year. Hence, it seems reasonable to conjecture that in the eyes of the Druids, also who revered the plant so highly, sacred mistletoe may have acquired a double portion of its mystic qualities at the solstice, and they have regularly cut it with solemn ceremony on Midsummer Eve. Be that as it may, certain it is that the mistletoe, the instrument of Balder's death, has regularly gathered for the sake of its mystic qualities on Midsummer Eve in Scandinavia, Balder's home. The plant is found commonly growing on pear trees, oaks, and other trees in thick, damp woods throughout the more temperate parts of Sweden. Thus, one of the two main incidents of Balder's myth is reproduced in the Great Midsummer Festival of Scandinavia. But the other main incident of the myth, the burning of Balder's body on a pyre, has also its counterpart in the bonfires which still ablaze or blazed till lately in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden on Midsummer Eve. It does not appear indeed that an effigy is burned in these bonfires, but the burning of an effigy is a feature which might easily drop out after its meaning was forgotten. And the name of Balder's balefires, Balder's Balar, by which these midsummer fires were formerly known in Sweden, puts their connection with Balder beyond the reach of doubt and makes it probable that in former times either a living representative or an effigy of Balder was annually burned in them. Midsummer was the season sacred to Balder, and the Swedish poet Tegner, in placing the burning of Balder at midsummer, may very well have followed an old tradition that the summer solstice was the time when the good god came to his untimely end. Thus, it has been shown that the leading incidents of the Balder myth have their counterparts in those fire festivals of our European peasantry, which undoubtedly date from long prior to the introduction of Christianity. The pretense of throwing the victim chosen by lot into the Beltane fire and the similar treatment of the man, the future green wolf, at the midsummer bonfire in Normandy may naturally be interpreted as traces of an older custom of actually burning human beings on these occasions. And the green dress of the green wolf, coupled with the leafy envelope of the young fellow who trod out the midsummer fire at Mushin, seems to hint that the persons who perished at these festivals did so in the character of tree spirits or deities of vegetation. From all this, we may reasonably infer that in the Balder myth on the one hand, and the fire festivals and custom of gathering mistletoe on the other hand, we have, as it were, the two broken and dissevered halves of an original whole. In other words, we may assume with some degree of probability that the myth of Balder's death was not merely a myth, that is, a description of physical phenomena and imagery borrowed from human life, but that it was at the same time the story which people told to explain why they annually burned a human representative of the god and cut the mistletoe with solemn ceremony. If I am right, the story of Balder's tragic end formed, so to say, the text of the sacred drama, which was acted year by year as a magical rite to cause the sun to shine, trees to grow, crops to thrive, and to guard man and beasts from the baleful arts of fairies and trolls, of witches and warlocks. The tale belonged, in short, to that class of nature myths which are meant to be supplemented by ritual. Here, as so often, myths stood to magic in the relation of theory to practice. But if the victims, the human Balders who died by fire, whether in spring or at midsummer, were put to death as living embodiments of tree spirits or deities of vegetation, it would seem that Balder himself must have been a tree spirit or deity of vegetation. It becomes desirable, therefore, to determine, if we can, the particular kind of tree or trees of which a personal representative was burned at the fire festivals. For we may be quite sure that it was not as a representative of vegetation in general that the victim suffered death. The idea of vegetation in general is too abstract to be primitive. Most probably, the victim at first represented a particular kind of sacred tree, but of all European trees, none has such claims as the oak to be considered as preeminently the sacred tree of the Aryans. We have seen that its worship is attested for all the great branches of the Aryan stock in Europe. Hence, we may certainly conclude that the tree was venerated by the Aryans in common before the dispersion, and that their primitive home must have lain in a land which was clothed with forest of oak. Now, considering the primitive character and remarkable similarity of the fire festivals observed by all the branches of the Aryan race in Europe, we may infer that these festivals form part of the common stock of religious observances which the various peoples carried with them in their wanderings from their old home. But if I am right, an essential feature of those primitive fire festivals was the burning of a man who represented the tree spirit. In view, then, of the place occupied by the oak in the religion of the Aryans, the presumption is that the tree so represented at the fire festivals must originally have been the oak. So far as the Celts and Lithuanians are concerned, this conclusion will perhaps hardly be contested. But both for them and for the Germans, it is confirmed by a remarkable piece of religious conservatism. The most primitive method known to man of producing fire is by rubbing two pieces of wood against each other till they ignite. And we have seen that this method is still used in Europe for kindling sacred fires, such as the need fire, and that most probably it was formerly resorted to at all the fire festivals under discussion. Now, it is sometimes required that the need fire or other sacred fire should be made by the friction of a particular kind of wood. And when the kind of wood is prescribed, whether among Celts, Germans, or Slavs, that would appear to be generally the oak. But if the sacred fire was regularly kindled by the friction of oak wood, we may infer that originally the fire was also fed with the same material. In point of fact, it appears that the perpetual fire of Vesta at Rome was fed with oak wood, and that oak wood was the fuel consumed in the perpetual fire which burned under the sacred oak at the great Lithuanian sanctuary of Romov. Further, that oak wood was formerly the fuel burned in the midsummer fires may perhaps be inferred from the custom said to be still observed by peasants in many mountain districts of Germany of making up the cottage fire on Midsummer Day with a heavy block of oak wood. The block is so arranged that it smolders slowly and is not finally reduced to charcoal till the expiry of a year. Then, upon the next midsummer day, the charred embers of the old log are removed to make room for the new one and are mixed with the seed corn or scattered about the garden. This is believed to guard the food cooked on the hearth from witchcraft, to preserve the look of the house, to promote the growth of the crops, and to keep them from blight and vermin. Thus, the custom is almost exactly parallel to that of the Yule log, which in parts of Germany, France, England, Serbia, and other Slavonic lands was commonly of oak wood. The general conclusion is that as those periodic or occasional ceremonies, the ancient Aryans both kindled and fed the fire with the sacred oak wood. But if at these solemn rites the fire was regularly made of oak wood, it follows that any man who was burned in it as a personification of the tree spirit could have represented no tree but the oak. The sacred oak was thus burned in duplicate. The wood of the tree was consumed in the fire, and along with it was consumed a living man as a personification of the oak spirit. The conclusion thus drawn for the European Aryans in general is confirmed in its special application to the Scandinavians by the relation in which amongst them the mistletoe appears to have stood to the burning of the victim in the midsummer fire. We have seen that among Scandinavians it has been customary to gather the mistletoe at midsummer, but so far as appears on the face of this custom, there is nothing to connect it with the midsummer fires in which human victims or effigies of them were burned. Even if the fire, as seems probable, was originally always made with oak wood, why should it have been necessary to pull the mistletoe? The last link between the midsummer customs of gathering the mistletoe and lighting the bonfires is supplied by Balder's myth, which can hardly be disjoined from the customs in question. The myth suggests a vital connection may once have been believed to subsist between the mistletoe and the human representative of the oak who was burned in the fire. According to the myth, Balder could be killed by nothing in heaven or earth except the mistletoe. And so long as the mistletoe remained on the oak, he was not only immortal but invulnerable. Now, if we suppose that Balder was the oak, the origin of the myth becomes intelligible. The mistletoe was viewed as the seat of life of the oak, and so long as it was uninjured, nothing could kill or even wound the oak. The conception of the mistletoe as the seat of life of the oak would naturally be suggested to primitive people by the observation that while the oak is deciduous, the mistletoe which grows on it is evergreen. In winter, the sight of its fresh foliage among the bare branches must have been hailed by the worshippers of the tree as a sign that the divine life, which had ceased to animate the branches, yet survived in the mistletoe, as the heart of a sleeper still beats when his body is motionless. Hence, when the god had to be killed, when the sacred tree had to be burnt, it was necessary to begin by breaking off the mistletoe. For so long as the mistletoe remained intact, the oak, so people might think, was invulnerable. All the blows of their knives and axes would glance harmless from its surface, but once tear from the oak its sacred heart, the mistletoe, and the tree nodded to its fall. And when in later times the spirit of the oak came to be represented by a living man, it was logically necessary to suppose that, like the tree he personated, he could neither be killed nor wounded so long as the mistletoe remained uninjured. The pulling of the mistletoe was thus at once the signal and the cause of his death. On this view, the invulnerable Balder is neither more nor less than a personification of a mistletoe bearing oak. The interpretation is confirmed by what seems to have been an ancient Italian belief that the mistletoe can be destroyed neither by fire nor water. For if the parasite is thus deemed indestructible, it might easily be supposed to communicate its own indestructibility to the tree on which it grows, so long as the two remain in conjunction. Or to put the same idea in mythical form, we might tell how kindly God of the oak had his life securely deposited in the imperishable mistletoe which grew among the branches. How accordingly, so long as the mistletoe kept its place there, the deity himself remained invulnerable, and how at last a cunning foe let into the secret of God's invulnerability toward the mistletoe from the oak, thereby killing the oak god, and afterwards burning his body in a fire which could have made no impression on him so long as the incombustible parasite retained its seat among the boughs. But since the idea of a being whose life is thus, in a sense, outside himself, must be strange to many readers, and has indeed not yet been recognized in its full bearing on primitive superstition, it will be worthwhile to illustrate it by examples drawn both from story and custom. The result will be to show that in assuming this idea as the explanation of Balder's reaction to the mistletoe, I assume a principle which is deeply engraved on the mind of primitive man. All right, that's it for today. Tune in with me later to see what's new books or information I have. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Good night. Shalom.